So a little while ago we had a minor accident where a student managed to impale part of their anatomy on the point of an outstretched sword. And it's led to a bit of a discussion on safety, particularly when it comes to thrusting. Okay, so when we strike blows at each other with blunt weapons, they have the potential to, break a bone, cut somebody open so they need stitches. But honestly, a blow is unlikely to cause a devastating, life-threatening or life-changing injury. Thrusts, on the other hand, have the potential to kill, actually, and certainly cause devastating injuries to, say, an eye or a throat or even severe damage into a hand. Okay, deep penetrative wounds are potentially there. So I'm going to do a pair of videos looking at both the weapons and what we wear in terms of protective equipment. Now, most sort of modern HEMA marketed jackets are rated to so many newtons, the same way that a modern fencing equipment is. That could be an extremely useful thing to have. So if you're using an epee-based small sword simulator, for example, then obviously it's extremely sensible to have something that is designed to defend yourself against one of these, because we know that people have died. Epee blades have broken and penetrated people's protective gear and killed them in modern fencing. So that's certainly a consideration. However, most of us are not using those, or certainly not using them exclusively. Most of us are using things like this, like something like that, or something like that. Okay, so the question is this sort of modern fencing evolved protective standard of any use for what we do whatsoever? If this blade breaks and comes out with a jagged point and I continue my thrust anyway, will the armor actually protect me or not? So we're going to test this, because I actually happen to have a side sword that snapped and ended up with a rather jagged little nasty point on it, and so I'm going to thrust it at various forms of armor and see what the result is. So this is the broken blade. You can see it ended up with a nasty jaggedy little point on the end of there. So I'm going to thrust it at a modern, supposedly penetrative resistant jacket and see whether or not it protects me from being stabbed by that nasty little point. And I'm going to simulate the worst case scenario, of course. So I've got this wrapped around a fairly solid plank, so we'll be able to see whether or not this penetrates the jacket and sticks into the plank or not. Get that out from behind there and bring it to the camera, and hopefully you can just see that I did in fact penetrate the jacket. Okay, so there is a millimetre or so of jaggedy little point that went straight through that. So that would have certainly reached flesh. This one is a non-Newton rated standard medieval gambesini thing, commercially available, widely used by reenactors. I'm going to do the same thrust and see whether or not this fares any better or any worse. And once again, that penetrated through, so you can see my jaggedy little point got through there. So no better, no worse, exactly the same, the point still penetrated. So finally, I've got my coat of plates. Okay, so these are fairly thin, but, solid plates of thin tin. So I'm going to attempt to stab my point through that and see whether or not the solid plates protect me. And unsurprisingly, of course, the steel tip failed to penetrate the steel plate. Of course, I could get in between plates. These things don't overlap, and I just get canvas. So let's try that. And that, also the tip penetrated through the material. So a couple of layers in canvas with some thin stuffing between them was equally insufficient. So, when it came down to it, actually, none of those pieces of armour were entirely safe against a jagged point from a broken sword. The point penetrated all three of them. The only thing that protected me was the solid plate, but unless I do it historically accurately and overlap those plates so that there's no gap there, there's still the potential for something to get through there and stab me. So is the Newton rating worth anything? Well, for what we do, it certainly doesn't hurt, but I would say that this is a very different kettle of fish to a broken epee. Okay, it's not the same thing. And I had no problem in driving this through the fencing rated jacket. It was no more difficult than I did through the heavily padded thing. But it's probably also worth pointing out that this is the sort of thing that we're trying to protect ourselves from, and these sorts of shards that you get on the end of broken swords are never more than a few millimeters long. Okay, so even though that thrust could have gone through and stabbed whoever was behind it in all three cases, it would have been a scratch. Okay, it would have been a nasty little scratch, a couple of millimeters deep at most, not something that is life-threatening, because unlike a broken epee, this is a fairly wide, thick piece of metal. Okay, and it's not going down to a narrow little needle point. It's a big, thick, wide thing, and most of the swords that we use are great, big, thick, wide things. Even a rapier is still a relatively thick and wide blade. And so the important thing is not really the puncture resistance, if you like. The important thing is really whether or not, having been punctured by the little sharp point, will the material tear to then allow the blade itself to penetrate the body. So for example, here I have an ordinary cotton pillowcase just stretched over the back of the chair there, and obviously that's not going to offer any resistance to the sharp point as I push it through there. More to the point, it's not going to offer any resistance to the tearing that will come as I push through that sword. And so if one was wearing simply a cotton shirt like that, this point would tear the material and allow entry to the entire blade, and that would be potentially extremely dangerous. On the other hand, if I fold a couple of pillowcases over a couple of times, so I've now got something that's, 8 layers of crappy cotton thick, and I do the same thing, that point still goes in, so I can now feel that sharp point is sticking out the back of the cotton there. But no matter how hard I push, it's no longer going to enter. It's not going to tear its way through the material and thus into the body. So really what we're looking for is not so much something that's going to stop penetration per se. Honestly, I don't think anything in the way of material is going to stop a sharp, jagged point on the end of a broken sword from cutting into it, okay? But as long as the material doesn't tear, then you're going to get resistance against the sort of big, thick, wide blades that we got. So is the sort of modern fencing standard that people are kind of insisting on of any use? Well, it doesn't hurt, and it certainly means that if you want to pick up small sword and use an epee-based trainer, you have something that will work for that. But I don't think it's the important thing as far as the sort of weapons that most of us use. Okay, what we're afraid of is a blade breaking like this, and I don't think anything on earth is going to stop that point from cutting into the material. But as long as that's as far as it goes, you get a little scratch from the little point there, and as long as the blade itself doesn't pass any further than that, that's all that's necessary. And there are many, many ways of doing that, of course. Okay, it doesn't have to be super penetration resistant material. Just 8 layers of material there is more than sufficient to stop that from happening. So, after all that, what is my conclusion? What should we be wearing? Well, obviously the most protective thing was the solid plates, the thing that's not only prevented the sharp point from getting any penetration at all, but also spread the impact of that thrust. And regardless of what sort of tip you have on the end of your sword, it's still an awful lot of force landing on a very, very small point. And anything you wear that is rigid that helps spread that impact is obviously going to be more protective and better for you. As far as protecting you from life-threatening injuries, a jagged, sharp, broken sword suddenly coming at you at full tilt, really, there's very little that you can wear that is going to prevent the sharp shard from reaching your body. What is important is that the armor protects you from the rest of the sword reaching you. So obviously the best thing to wear would be the historical solution, which is something like mail. And you can certainly get the jagged point through the mail, but the mail links will prevent the rest of the sword getting in. But there are many ways to achieve that. So thick leather, many layers of material. It doesn't have to be Olympic fencing rated, though that obviously doesn't hurt. There's no reason not to, but it's not strictly necessary. There are many ways of achieving equivalent protection. The other thing to point out is that material, regardless of what rating it starts with, does degenerate over time, okay, with wear and with sweat and with exposure to the sun and all these things. They do wear out. So it's something I notice a lot with my leather armor, is it's impenetrable when it's freshly made, but after 5 years, 10 years, the leather can become very brittle. And the same thing happens with material as well. And so you've got to be a little bit careful about using gear for a very, very long time, and it can deteriorate to the point where the material will just tear through. And it's the tearing that we're really concerned about, not so much the penetration resistance in and of itself. So that's the first part of the video. In the next one we will look at the weapons that we're using and how we tip them and what is the most effective way of tipping them in order to make thrusting safe. Doing what we do, you're going to receive a blow that's going to cause a devastating injury, a life-changing injury, or potentially kill you. Thrusting, pussycat, goodness me.